It's the top 50 albums of 2018. I'll keep it short and simple. These are simply only chosen because I like them. And you may be surprised about how many albums that I didn't necessarily like earlier in the year becoming absolute favourites, and vice versa, as well as albums that I didn't review at all, but becoming surprising contenders for the big list. Regardless of how the list unfolds, I hope that you enjoy it nonetheless, and you manage to get a few recommendations out of this, or at least have your favourites affirmed, because that's always a nice feeling, isn't it? But before we get into the big top 50, I want to go over some honourable mentions, because there are quite a lot. There are like 20 which I really wanted to include on the list, but I couldn't because 50 is such a limited number, and I don't think I'd be able to make a top 100 that captivating. So you can tell that my need to leave some albums off really upsets me. Like, look at me. I'm really upset. I'm really upset.
Miscellaneous, Mr. Molly inside my psyche. Incredible emptiness in my body.
I don't got no new friends. That's how you get loose ends. I need. And I got all of what I had you where I want it. When we gon' have it. When we gon' sit, we don't seem to want it. The question is not even the thought.
Afternoon, vanilla sun crawls away without a sound.
I go outside and I feel free.
And the love that you feel will be here when you are. That's just the way that I feel.
Music nerds love the Talking Heads, especially the most essential and celebrated album from 1980, Remain in Light. The wonder of it came with how the Heads and Brian Eno used bouncy, infectious loops of flashy, layered instrumentation to create something that was esoteric, but also ridiculously fun to listen to, again and again. I'm sure Kermit the Frog agrees, so does my t-shirt. But what is a little bit more underappreciated is the inspiration for the styles of Remain in Light, the African funk roots specifically. ANGELIQUE KIDJO was intrigued and in awe of this, and her reimagination of Remain in Light was one of the most tasteful and enjoyable tributes to an artist that I'd treated myself to this year. I would even suggest that if you aren't a Talking Heads fan, listen to this anyways. It really does have its own unique spark to it that might click with you. I'd also recommend re-listening to the original until it becomes something that you enjoy. But that's just being nitpicky now. KIDJO stays true to the enchanting quality of the original, while breathing into Burns' once cryptic and impenetrable passages of lyrics a new, humane, spiritual life. The heat still goes on. Often, I find myself disappointed that MITSKI won't write longer songs, but hearing them all in one collection helps me realise yet again that keeping each train of thought boiled down to their crucial words is actually a perfect format for her albums. Be the Cowboy manages to embody a bunch of different styles that I wouldn't have necessarily expected from a singer-songwriter like MITSKI. However, it just shows her versatility as a songwriter. I do wish that they were a bit longer, but they're still good songs anyways. From the roaring catharsis of Geyser to the weeping confessional country twanged track Lonesome Love, or the nutty metaphors on Washing Machine Heart, or the equivalent of making a slip and slide out of your grieving tears on Nobody. It's a big risk to not have a particular mood or even musical style to stick to, as MITSKI leaps between several, but it's wonderful to hear not only that she's making brave forays into unfamiliar and unpredictable territory, but that each little moment can still feel confessional and shattering regardless. I nominate the line "Nobody fucks me like me" for the realest lyric of the year.
Radiation is present, got my reflection, iridescent. Every little moment I step in, might shift the planet's direction. Glitch in the system is present.
It's been quite the turbulent year for your average high schooler's favourite boy band, and there are so many reasons that Iridescence might have fallen apart. And the thing is, it did, but in no bad way at all, in my opinion anyways. This one's quite a polarising one. Brockhampton are unmistakably about emotional honesty as much as they are about having a fun time. So this album hits me tough when it builds up a passion to do both. Considering the band's transition into a new phase of their career, following a new record deal, and the controversial departure of the best member, according to annoying fans, Iridescence, to me at least, feels like a journey of attempting to convince yourself that everybody is eventually going to move on to new and potentially better things, even if past sentiments are going to make that difficult to cope with. It's only ironic that after seeing this album performed front to back live in Auckland during the night of its release, forgetting an epiphany like that is just about impossible. Beyond any sentimentality that some viewers who don't exactly bump Brockhampton on their father's aux cord to the repeated dismay of their family might not find in this record, Iridescence IRIDESCENCE is just a set of really great creative hip-hop songs. And at its core, for me, that's all it really needed to be. Don't be at all fooled by the two twinkly and frankly beautiful tracks that open this record. They represent the turbulence and blackened vision of its remainder about as much as a Pale Waves album. They do, however, serve an exceptional purpose within the context of the album, and powerfully so, acting as the calm before the storm, in which the latter provides guttural yells emphasizing upon the words doubt and suffocated. So perhaps we're not in the clear after all. It is one of the most impressive mathcore efforts to invest your time into this year, if only because the enlightening streaks of awe that run through its second half are something to truly behold. Uplifting indeed. Admittedly, I found myself becoming bored of modern day psychedelic rock. I'm sure it's got a lot to offer, but most of what I end up being exposed to is the same jangly reverb-soaked guitar pop with 4-note solos thrown in. The homogeneity of such a promising genre isn't particularly helped by the fact that any 5 long-haired men in unironed shirts could come up to me, claim they're Tame Impala, and I would unhesitatingly believe them. MYTHIC SUNSHIP aren't anywhere near that stylistic vein, so it feels unfair to compare them directly, but they were a nice reminder that heavy and hazy psychedelic rock has the chance to feel truly refreshing again. The bulk of it is improvised solos, but that much is made truly epic by sheer sonic ambition, sounding dense, jazzy, and thunderous. As one of the truly esoteric singer-songwriters around nowadays, Heather Lee finds herself conjuring greater, sparser worlds than before, out of the echoing, lengthily drawn sounds of a guitar, and the howls of her own voice on Throne, a truly spectral moment in time. Each awaited shift in melody is like a new weight being lifted off your chest.
We have become marionettes to twerk beats, disconnected from freedom songs and the rhythm of marching feet.
Although KHALAB is an Italian producer, Black Noise 2048 is an unbound statement on behalf of African roots music, respectfully tributing the histories of Afro-funk, spiritual jazz, and house music to create a very sincere sonic collage, brave and breathtaking in both its spirit and message. Yo, to any new viewers of this channel, I'd like to set a stern warning to anyone. In this house, we don't disrespect Florence Welsh.
We climbed onto the roof, the museum, and someone made love in the park.
And that's just a rule, we just don't break it. High as Hope is the most extravagant album currently offered by Florence Welsh and her acquaintances, or The Machine as we so often know them as. High as Hope is both garden lush and perseverant, and there's a wonderful shift of focus to the scope of a song and the way that it builds up over time, as if it were a steady march where your spirit would raise with every next step. So sure, by no means is this a step into new territory for Welsh, but it's more of an intimate and optimistic embrace of what makes her music so special. No matter how larger than life it becomes, there's always a visible heart at the center of it, to remind you that all of that noise is driven by the passion of one person. I suppose Italy and volatility go hand in hand. This was my first big favourite of the year, and one listen through its rather brief runtime will show you, not tell you, just why it grabbed my attention so well. It's a menacing stew of urgent screams and thundering riffage, and the hasty runtime ensures that it doesn't tire out after too long. If this underground Puerto Rican band truly have been around since the early 90s, then their music must have been very ahead of its time. But even if it wasn't back then, right now they're bringing the flames back to stoner rock in a way that is scarily apocalyptic. Stoner rock? What's that? Well, it's basically like a very heavy psychedelic rock. And when I say heavy, I do mean heavy. It's been a while since I've had a head rush of excitement from listening to a record like this. I mean, they've all been unmistakably good, just very predictable. This had something a bit new to offer. From the moment that it begins, it feels like we've caught fire while hurtling through the stratosphere, dwindling from space to surface. The rest follows suit. Tim Hecker's grasp of sound design here is worry unfolding. It wouldn't be hard at all to call this the most distressing in a discography that has undergone tranquility, transcendence, and tenderness over the course of many an album. But the new album KONOYO is more on the edge of feeling trapped. Futility and defeat spring to mind, and the detail in these phantom-like soundscapes prove yet again that Hecker is more in touch with raw human despair than most people. Of all albums this year that are to be considered unsettling or dark, it was rather refreshing to hear one that genuinely did feel like both of those things. One that definitely did disturb the currents out of my nervous system and leave my face a frigid, arrested, glassed over surface out of sheer worry as to what was going to happen next. I'm not ashamed to admit that at all. In fact, I give it all the props for being able to sculpt noise into something that is consistently distressing. I'm sure the cover artwork isn't a huge help. Ben Frost would be stoked. The power in this Italian duo's droning, glitch-laden music comes from their choice of instrumentation. Harmonium, cello, piano, and guitar all together bear a sense of soul-crushing dread, but in ways that don't really feel the need to overpower with booming noise. AMULETO seem to understand the idea of subtlety in music, so even the solo passages are just as potent as the brief moments of cacophony. In other words, quiet moments are just as good as the loud ones. It's a bit shameful of me to admit that Sleep are more aptly named than would be fortunate. I'm not as infatuated with Holy Mountain or Dope Smoker as I once was, but their first album in 15 years happens to be a complete refresher for a band that has focused more on brooding slow-motion progressions over the course of an hour during the meteor phase of their career. Ironically, their bulkiest sounding release yet is this one album that they dropped in 2018. And the Sciences opposes the dreary, doomy tempo and the stoned ethos of Dope Smoker, and aims for a much more immediate, groove-heavy affair, with all burly guitar riffs buzz-sawing as if they were weaponized, but of course they decide to kick it all off with the sound of a bong hit. The Polish band Lonka C begin this album with what at first seems like it's going to be a very peaceful and mystical ambient piece. Then, before you get too comfortable, they start blowing it up into one of the coolest jazz rock albums of the year. It's hard to succinctly put into words how fierce the build-up and payoff on Lillian Gish becomes, but I can sure as hell try. Saxophone and drum go big fire and boom boom. This is the sickest taunt I've ever heard.
Work it. Work to be a winner.
Swallowing bass lines and repeating techno loops dripped with spoken word verses full of snarky attitude, and these minute glassy details like tiny chips in a marble sculpture. No matter how often a musical loop will recur, it continues to build on the utopian setting that only grows uneasier with each passing minute. It works. She works. All the fucking time. I sort of realised over time that ambient glitch soundscapes aren't really what the locals are banging in Bar 101 nowadays, but I still have plenty of love to throw Brett Nork's way, especially learning about how he pieces his music together. The Mansion is a tranquil yet mind-bending odyssey through digital space. Nork's layering of synthesizers is interspersed with field recordings of faint clicking and insect chirps, which is both fascinating but also eerie, because I'm not really going to be keen about the prospect of a cricket hanging around the corner of my living room. It's an evocative album though, and to the point where each piece of the puzzle sounds, and maybe even feels, like an electric current circuiting a wire loop in your skull. I almost can't even believe this record, but it's so good. Santeria music fused with elements of chamber music and even a little bit of jazz. It sounds both authentic to the culture that it's about, but also incredibly progressive and transcendental. Transcendental. I love saying that word. Dial-It is a bit of an enigma.
Just to feel like this, it took a long time, yeah. Just to look like this, it took a long time, yeah.
At once it manages to slide comfortably into the trap rap letterbox that's been having vapid sludge mailed to it for the past few years, and yet it also manages to be utterly and fascinatingly exciting. I don't hate trap rap at all, by the way. I think it's a bit stupid of me to want to even disclaim that in the first place. Playboy Carti strolls in, not necessarily changing the norm at all, instead amplifying it to levels so hefty and dangerous I almost felt like I was seconds away from being trampled by a furious mosh pit crowd. I mean, all of it relies on repetition and boiling an entire style of music down to its bare bone essentials, but so does Steve Reich's catalogue, and music fanatics love that minimalism flick. So what's wrong with a little bit of it in rowdy trap banger form to have a little bit of fun? At number 31, we have a representative from the Yeezy season. Remember Kanye's album, Ye? Well, the album at this spot is Ye's whimsical, flirtatious, and only comparatively better behaved cousin. Kanye West and Kid Cudi stamped out the tension between them, and it was one of two of the most wholesome events to result in a new musical project. The other one was Ichiko Ayoba picking up an acoustic guitar again. Kid See Ghosts finds its wonders in painting their grievances and troubles into larger-than-life portraits, chasing and defeating the ghosts that haunt their psyches, saddling those who they love most, and speeding off into the brave and optimistic future. It's home to satisfying verses from Kanye, who decides to actually make an effort this time around, Cudi's unforgettable mantras in which he sounds the most charismatic that he's been all decade, and above all, otherworldly production that grapples a ridiculous amount of colourful ideas all at once like a child in a jelly bean shop. Here's another one that may have surprised you.
It can be bad, you won't spend the night, you'll never be who you thought you were true. Everything's see-through, trust me, I feel you.
I needed something like this. It's loud, it's distorted, with the bombast of windows being smashed with a vexed fist. Through their bouts of frustration and adamant pleas to be treated without scrutiny and alienation, black dresses give a clear camera shot into the viewpoints of a transgender individual that has faced enough destruction of self-esteem and safety to take a toll on their composure, and it shows. Waist Isolation is anxious and constantly combating trauma with every loud, clattering hook as a means of screaming, even laughing the pain away. It does have a very sardonic and twisted sense of humour, but that's only fueled by the circumstances surrounding it. Aside from a message that definitely feels like it has to be expressed on this record as a coping device of sorts, Black Dresses have also offered one of the most powerfully produced and bombastic industrial albums of the year. To be honest, on the same wavelength as some of the early 9 Inch Nails albums. Pretty Hate Machine is my go-to comparison, and I'm not even a big fan of that one. Big fan of this one though. The track In My Mouth is a voring anthem, so there's that too. Honestly, anyone can make an unholy racket, but making one genuinely sound as if it's ready to crush you into scrap tissue is another story, really. Before Daughters came forward to send absolutely everyone into a state of utter pandemonium, this was the noisy no-wave stunner of 2018, sticking to rhythms that felt like your submission to a lumbering march, and catching you off guard in a swirl of disorienting, noise. I mean, noise is the easy word to use, but perhaps Nod are more convincing with it than most, tempering it into cavernous, raucous, and steel-plated prisons of sound.
This for Trayvon and Tree, burn the bush and chronic. Speaking honestly, we living in colonies, singing instant comedy.
Truthfully, when this album dropped, I was so caught up in the rampant, vicious energy of Denzel Curry's aggressive cadence and staccato flow, and the foggy, mysterious darkness of the album's atmosphere, that I ended up completely brushing past the fact that Taboo isn't an album with subject matter to take lightly at all. Not solely because Curry's aggression comes in spouts of threatening violence and self-harm, rather that these sequences are flashes of dark visions that come to his mind in moments where traumatic and violating memories haunt his psyche. It's not an album here to yell grief and anguish for the sake of a theatre show, although those that are familiar with the video for Clout Cobain will have realised that idea already. Much more that it has an extremely deep unhappiness causing all of it, and Curry spends the 3 acts of this opus attempting to dig deep inside himself and deal with it all. This is a tribute in numerous ways, to the uprising of society in times of political and social turmoil, to the numerous black women who are honoured and celebrated as vital leaders of movements and oppressed people, to the numerous black musical styles that have had gigantic impacts on modern music and art in general, from dub to dancehall, from Afrobeat to Afro-funk. I'd say it's the kind of raised fist protest to flash the fancy of Fela Kuti. If you're a viewer of this channel that's been watching the videos since the start of this year, you may remember this album being one of the first ones of 2018 that I gave really high acclaim to. Admittedly, while it has cooled down on me, I couldn't deny, and I'd definitely feel like a fool if I were to forget that it is one of the most abyssal and captivatingly dark things that I heard all year. I'm a big fan of this singer-songwriter, and this is easily the best thing she's done so far. This is a cursed display of all that Anna von Hauswolf was ever capable of. If the opener gives you a sense of awe and blissful triumph, watch it all crumble and let you fall into a sonic pit of nightmarish church organs and abyssal wailing. There is a reason that it's called Dead Magic. Jeffrey Gurumul Yunupingu is widely known as a performing icon in Australian Indigenous music, spinning traditional songs of his native land into universally beautiful folk music. This posthumous endeavour isn't really a folk record as expected though. It is instead a daring foray into minimalism with a grandiose symphony. At its foundation, it is a fiercely moving soundtrack to Australian nature, erupting and weeping all at once, but there's a strangely triumphant effect that this new ambitious change in instrumentation for Gurumul has shifted his voice into. In place of a voice that is close and humanly touching, it becomes one that boldly ascends and hypnotizes as one final empowering call. For every moment on Pastoral that seems far too inhumane and monstrous to even be able to emotionally grapple with, Gazelle Twin somehow manages to drip feed through it all a sense of worry. Its political commentary bites violently like gnashing teeth, with an industrial influence that is out both to scare and hypnotize, and especially the latter considering its ability to loop some musical passages while taking another musical passage and splashing it into that one's face. The effect is highly memorable, even if difficult to come to terms with at first, but placing it into the second half of this list should be convincing enough. I'm far too aware at this point that the true release date of this album was 2016, and only now have we seen an international distribution for Communion, but we've dug too far in and I'm not backing out now. This album's reissue has been an awe-inspiring discovery for 2018, even as we move into its final moments of reflection. It's amazing that an atmosphere can seem so thick despite there only being one instrumental playing at times. Alongside the Yangyeom and Sangwang, traditional Korean instruments, Park Ji-ha's tranquil and forlorn soundscapes pop with more and more colour, plus grieving emotion the further that it moves on, like a sketch of a somber world slowly being drawn to life. At the age of 80, the accomplished and celebrated Brazilian performer Elza Soares is fronting some of the nuttiest art rock with dance flavours from her home country. It's inspiring to think that age may not necessarily be a drawback or an obstacle as many people may perceive, but it can instead be a display of all the experience and the wisdom that the artist has acquired over many years, and in this case, decades of creating art. After being enchanted by the volatile, the fierce, and the samba-inspired A Mulher do Fim do Mundo in 2016, a record that provided a stern look into the social unrest and poverty-stricken conditions of urban Brazil, Deus é a Mulher, God is a Woman in Portuguese, takes a strong stand for women and the feminine with a new ferocity, even with a shocking dance punk flavour that had me reeling in ecstasy. It's an essential listen for its idiosyncratic style and its infectious attitude, and should go down as one of the best late career albums of all time, really. Sometimes, all that it takes to melt hearts is an acoustic guitar and a voice. Ichiko Ayoba's been doing it for years. Although each little installment isn't a far cry from the last, it's her ability to be so consistently charming with what little she has, and that keeps me looking forward. As such, it'd be silly to expect much more from QP than what Ayoba's music has mostly been so far, although superfans will know how much Zero and her live albums deviate noticeably from that norm. But what we have on QP is something truly spectacular for how simple it is. Soothing acoustic folk songs where melody cradles the song's beauty like the caring hands of a puppy's owner. It's difficult to be any more poetic about an album so ridiculously simple, so I'd much rather let that music do the talking.
Last time that we went down, I was not feeling very good.
Although this one is mastered with enough blast power to make Rick Rubin curl up into the fetal position. I'm sorry, it's another Rick Rubin joke. There's something sourly intoxicating about A Laughing Death in Meat Space, the debut album from this strange and unafraid supergroup formed by members from Melbourne bands The Drones, High Tension and Palm Springs. Loaded with sardonic political fury and neurotic melodies, so really standard fare for Gareth Lydiard, this album can sometimes emerge a bit too loud and too densely packed for comfort at times, but the waves of ferocity are still relentless and somehow addictive, even if there's only just one track that offers any breathing room at all. There is a point on this album, maybe around the Sandstorm-esque 2 afternoons, where the initial fun of this record actually starts to feel a little bit stomach-churning and transitions into a realization that, whoa, this is actually pretty scary. Submit this one for Rock Record of the Year.
I don't need no airtime, I just want a little spare time. Care about a fresh pair, I just want a little fresh air. Ride my bike down to
The rush of Tom Scott's solo debut as Avondale Bowling Club finds him at his most honest and introspective, yet in a completely daring way, enlisting a jazz band to accompany his tales of young adulthood. The instrumentation swells and plateaus in response to aspects of his storytelling, with each shift in rhythm feeling like a new epiphany. Genuinely one of the finest and most artful rap records I've heard all year. And it's from Auckland. What a rip. It feels stupid to attempt to even push this album into several genre labels when it's one that is actively fueling an effort to liberate itself from confinement. Ooh, that was word soup, that one. Granted, said confinement is likely to be more about the entrapment and the trauma within love than some arbitrary music reviewer trying to keep their list entry structures consistent, but still, it's worth pointing out that Safe in the Hands of Love goes about presenting those anxious and eventually erupting feelings within a series of highly eclectic and musically unpredictable vignettes, hopping from one dense and ethereal idea to the next, like some sort of a game of surrealist hopscotch. The result is extremely hypnotic, and along the way, despite Yves Tumor's enigmatic presence as an artist, we really receive a vivid, though still somewhat impenetrable snapshot into their personal experiences and fears. You might think this is a surreal album in its presentation, but the message that it hands to you, within blasts of sudden noise rock spittle and warped synthesizer post-punk inspired pop that'd make Public Image Limited proud, is actually pretty tangible and down to earth. Supposedly in Spain, every generation finds its flamenco nuevo star, and although I'm sure that its revival is a lot more niche than us Western folk might initially assume, I'm glad that Rosalía is the one that represents it, considering her sudden rise in popularity. El Malcarrera isn't anywhere near as intimate or skeletal as Los Angeles, but instead makes comfortable swerves towards the contemporary pop sound that dominates the mainstream. This sounds like a complete compromise in identity, but it truly isn't, as the same vocal power, especially those incredible vibratos, are still put on display. And over the course of this brief but self-convinced half hour, everything from catchy flirtations with autotune to homages to Arthur Russell and Justin Timberlake of all people opens the doors for Rosalía to experiment with pop flavors while channeling the foundations of her culture with those traditional flamenco styles. These are two musical worlds that she was brought up with and are now to be fused in exceptional ways.
I'm the pot calling the kettle black, where there's no brake pedals at, between God and where the devil's at. Had the double dutch.
I'd love to give you a retrospective of Pusha T's brief dose of controversy sparked this year, following one of the most daring conclusions to a hip-hop beef, but I'm too busy to do that because I'm bumping his album that released shortly before that on public transport wherever I go. Auckland transport doesn't exactly get to places on time, but that only gives me a chance to press play once again and re-experience its brief 21 minutes. Daytona has the power in brevity, airtight in quality, and razor sharp with witty lyric after witty lyric. I'm sure my ad-lib would be ugh if I was spitting punchlines that nasty. And the production is just as clever and cutting, handled by an enigmatic newcomer to the game, Mr. K West. Not too familiar with his material because his name isn't necessarily one of the ones that's been circulating all the headlines this year, but I do wish him all the best and a wonderfully fruitful career.
I'm chasing shadows in the gallows, collecting what was stolen from me. I guess the stamina and no manners.
Although Cocoa Sugar isn't the Young Father's meatiest album, over time I've come to realize that it is probably their most honest, and in honesty comes a lot of room for emotive framing, which the album has plenty of, but only little time to bumble around for. You get these hypnotic, robust grooves that hum like bass lines on an Alan Vega project, and a chillingly transcendent take on spirituals that result in songs that might take you several listens to realize that they're perhaps some of the best that they've delivered so far. I suppose I'm just glad that the Mercury curse hasn't struck its place. Following their win in 2014, the Scottish trio haven't fallen into an inactive dip of obscurity, but have still found exciting ways to push themselves, their musical ambition and personal statements beyond expectation. The Vaporwave aesthetic is one of the most fascinating and evocative obsessions the internet has clamped onto during this side of the decade, and here George Clanton is, sweeping up a little bit of it for himself and moulding something aqua splash refreshing and groove heavy catchy. Beyond the walls of sound that are a little bit like hearing Tears for Fears trapped in a Sega Dreamcast, George Clanton is a more than capable songwriter and vocalist when it comes to floating his vulnerabilities out for listeners to hear and feel engaged with. In fact, I'd say the gushing emotions in the instrumentals and in his voice go hand in hand without letting one totally dominate the other. All it takes is a little bit of confidence, which is probably a little bit tricky to muster up at times, but it can result in wonderful things. Let me, or Clanton rather, tell you. Both Ado Rook and Devi McCallion, perhaps known most as the two members of the noise pop duo Black Dresses, were involved with a flurry of various projects in 2018. I'm pretty sure they dropped about 3 million projects in silence, but one of my favourites out of the ones that I was able to keep up with was Rook's solo album Shed Blood, a wildly cathartic record facing the trauma and ostracism that a transgender individual experiences.
My soul is
I am most glad that many listeners with similar experiences find solace in Rook's confessional writing, as well as her ear for cathartic songwriting, but I still see plenty to appreciate about such a daring set of tracks posed from the viewpoint of one single human being with a scary amount to come forward about. And for those who listen to Black Dresses and might have not been a fan of the heavily distorted output of their music, Rook's solo material is a little bit easier to digest musically and more melodic on the ears, but to be honest, it really isn't less adamant and bold and fist-waving about with its vital message. Earl Sweatshirt is known for voicing his personal grievances, but it's just as vital to note that his music marks his attempts to keep soldiering on and bettering himself.
Face looking like I stumbled out of pit, $100 chip. I piss problems out the bottle empty. Mama said she used to see my father in me.
The circumstances of the aptly and passively titled Some Rap Songs are shattering, but over the course of this album he finds a way to tussle with the tense climate of the past few years while making personal movements forward for himself in daring epiphanies. Admittedly, I only see this album continuing to grow on me with further listens, because it is one that rewards not just patience, but also open-mindedness to the expression of his own grief.
Our parents from the South, and if I make $1 million, I'll vacation in the South.
It doesn't take very long for Care For Me to strike you with the grief that it's so clearly trying to come to terms with. On the opening track, Saba starkly addresses how his cousin, John Walt, was killed for a coat. The track Life is an uneasy grappling on the volatility of life, and especially now that it's been shaken by such a trauma. He addresses how writing his troubles away is a catharsis on calligraphy. Fighter reminisces on familial memories, and Smile wishes for an escape back to the South, hoping to find peace with his parents. It is only once the increasingly nerve-wracking crux of the album, Prom King, arrives that Saba lets loose with the details of the entire story that fueled the survivor's guilt and a crushing turning point in his life. Saba's confessions are paired with lush, fluid instrumentals, well versed in the soul and the jazz that they're so clearly inspired by, but it just wouldn't be the same were it not for his ability to breathe life into them with either pensiveness or urgency at just the right moments. Having given this enough time and listens, this is paired with Avantdale Bowling Club as the two most therapeutic and most beautiful hip-hop albums that I listened to this year. Meanwhile attempting to convince myself that overlong jazz epics aren't always necessary endeavours, Micaiah McCraven manages to mesmerise me for an hour and a half with a therapeutic jazz statement. Without words, McCraven raises the tension like roaring waves, but what separates Universal Beings from many other ferocious jazz albums that I've heard is its percussive and rhythmic section. Each percussive rhythm is a sturdy but eerily mechanical bass for a track, which leaves a really interesting hip-hop-esque influence on the album, only making certain moments even more potent when one of the tracks begins to become so rampant and furious that even the rhythmic section of the band is struggling to keep up, and these moments of disarray work wonders and never even feel forced nor clumsy. When Kimbra's third album Primal Heart was delayed from early January until April 20th, I wasn't so much disappointed as I was excited, knowing the sheer boldness that had come into previous singles like the triumphant, earth-shattering Top of the World, which made my list last year, and the waltzy, windy Everybody Knows. I had a lingering feeling that the rest of Primal Heart was going to follow suit by being just as creative, colour-splashed, emotionally strung, and above all, hooky to the nth degree, because I like a lot of pop albums to be that way. As I guessed correctly, this album sees that sparkly eccentricity and potent imagination spillage being given their catchiest form yet. I think it's Kimbra's best album to date.
And we will find our way. They'll know just what they do on the TV.
Seeing a lot of those songs performed live only increased that love for it. The gorgeous cover artwork reflects the colour that pops with every next song, and although it's not the most consistent run of musical ideas, that matters so little to me when nearly every moment is so uniquely infectious. Kimbra is an icon, pass it on. If you informed me at any time before July that my album of the year would be a nu metal album, I would have had a hearty chuckle, mainly because most nu metal albums seem to be able to evoke that into me, a very hearty chuckle indeed. Arizona, on the other hand, wasn't laughable, but was instead a highly inventive channeling of old school hardcore styles that gives metalcore the boost of creativity it's been practically begging for. A dizzying whirlwind with wackily shifting instrumentals that simultaneously embraces and defies what metalcore is all about. Put on your windbreaker and get freaky. Now this was astonishing.
Que la tortilla se vuelva y que lo pobre coman pan y lo rica mierda, mierda.
For nearly 2 hours, Nino de Elche, also known as the lead singer of peppery post-rock band Escuela, strains his dystopian and frankly terrifying exercises of traditional Hispanic folk and dance styles, and most importantly, he never loses me, but he does sound as if he loses his mind though, haunting through and through with the ghoulish and wispy currents of Disc 1, which takes a very ambient musique concrète turn to the livelier, dancier, but no less unsettling Disc 2. In ways it's almost as if one is listening to a mixtape of flamenco songs that are written to reflect a post-apocalyptic landscape. It only makes sense that we end up hearing a wildly agonized Tim Buckley cover along the way. I'd also like to disclaim very boldly that there was a high note that Elche hits towards the very end that pretty much made me entirely shit myself. So this was it, huh? Even before its official release, the comeback effort from Daughters, a band that had previously dabbled in grindcore and manic post-punk, was making gigantic waves on the internet, particularly on Rate Your Music, in a way that was pretty uncanny to me. It turns out that this predetermined acclaim wasn't really a fluke, because such an album became the runaway favourite for noisy music on this side of the year for many, even Decade in some excited minds. Sensibly, which this album is not, I should disclaim, You Won't Get What You Want is predictably misanthropic in the lyrical sense, but its swirling hellwind of sound proves a lot more of the album's intended atmosphere than most that try to put up that same effect. It's actually rather poetic in how dread-inducing it wants to be. In other words, it's not fucking around, and it's not melodramatic either. It's stomach-churning, it's a storm of suffering, but weirdly, if you're into those dissonant monsoons of noise, it's also a damn decent dance punk album too. My gut feeling is to tell you as little as possible about this, but that kind of defeats the point of a recommendation, really. Three masters of the electronic avant-garde build monumental soundscapes out of microscopic noises, with each groove feeling akin to fingers lightly tapping the inside of my skull. It's terrifying, and it's constantly building and building to those final moments, with a finale that leaves me utterly torn apart. It's one of the most unique musical experiences to hear this year, and even if you are familiar with work from either of those three artists that you can compare this live recording to, the combined efforts of the trio culminate in something cold and calculated, but to great effect, something that is soul-crushing in its own special way. I find it crazy that it's all done live. I don't know that much about Mid-Ear Thief, and judging by the lack of information about them online, I doubt a lot of others do either. They're from Seoul in South Korea, and they make incredibly beautiful, tear-jerking music, and maybe that's as far as we'll be able to go in terms of background information, and that's fine. Crumbling doesn't really need a context for you to grasp the beauty of it, as it magically fuses the homely sounds of folk music and chamber pop, even with a pulsating psychedelic influence, peppered with those otherworldly, outlandish tinkers of electronic and glitch music. It's poignant and pretty, like a song of romance between you and the last other person on a desolate planet Earth. Realistically speaking, that'd probably go terribly, but I think Mid-Ear Thief would like you to escape reality for a moment.
Bottom of you, I love you from the space beneath my feet, and beneath that.
It's alluring and devilish in the way that most love-oriented albums aren't. Josiah Wise finds himself falling a slave to love, and in no pithy, hesitant way either. Wise's imagery is brutal and unforgiving, which contrasts interestingly with his very angelic voice. And while the album does occasionally come close to sounding heavenly, it does subvert this suddenly by burrowing further into darker pits. It's a fascinating duality that ends up keeping me enchanted as well as completely unsettled, and the production with just enough going on, which is inspired by gospel, chamber music, and post-industrial of all genre combos, allows the music to dwell in its own introspection. It's a truly unique R&B album, and that's if it could truly be classified as one. After hearing this and reading about Crampton's underlying inspirations and messages to deliver regarding indigenous survival and queerness, I'm extremely excited to hear what else Alicia Crampton has in store for the future. Not that these messages are particularly clear, but there's a weird quality to the composition. It's like you're able to pick emotions and certain images out of such a barrage of noise. At an airtight 18 minutes, Crampton wastes absolutely no time clashing together angular sound effects that tessellate in freaky, hypnotic ways. Quite frankly, I'm still perplexed impressed at how well these rhythms are formed from the dense layering of sound effects, even an air horn at some point. Crampton leaves these overwhelming and psychedelic concepts running for only as long as they need to be. Any longer and I'm sure it would have been a bit tiring, but she only moves swiftly onto the next wacky idea once she has one going for enough time. As I said in my review, it's the musical equivalent to bus seat patterns, and it absolutely would have been my album of the year if it weren't for one more. Let's not beat around the bush here. Even if you've just seen the thumbnail for my most recent review, you'd have seen that it was 13 minutes, so I clearly had a lot to say about it. Yeah, honestly, this one slapped into place very snugly, like the final piece to a jigsaw puzzle. And of course, it's Aviary. I'd like to make a disclaimer. It's difficult to recommend Aviary as a starter's guide to Julia Holter, not because it doesn't represent her therapeutic, threateningly involving approach to sound design well enough. It's more that it does that. Exactly. Just super duper intensely. It's a 90-minute album that encases Holter's own reckoning with her feelings and urges to bestow that passion upon the world, but it struggles to find the means of doing so. At times language even starts to fail her, but it's the music on Aviary that feels like a volcanic expression that had been kettling inside her for far too long now. It's overwhelming, but it's also sparse. Holter balances tones and colours and moods on Aviary expertly, which is an achievement considering how unkempt it seems to be at first. It's light and dark, it's peaceful and noisy, it's pretty and ugly. One side is an essential complement to the other, just like it is in reality. But towards the end, I love that she manages to let some of the beautiful chamber string moments sing for themselves with little interruption, and ultimately instilling a sense of complete wonder and appreciation for the scope of the world and humanity. Or at least it does for me anyways. And perhaps Aviary is too long for some listeners, or too meandering, or too absurd, or even grating. Every Day is an Emergency seems to be the split-off point for many in particular, even though I personally love that track, and following from that, I really find that every moment is paramount to the effect of the album. Each soundscape intrigues me just as much as the next, and many even being powerful progressions from a previous moment, like the I Shall Love suite. I couldn't blame anyone if they didn't find every separate moment as captivating as I did, but I have to say that it all just fell into place for me over time. I suppose I just had to be patient with it. And it was a challenge very worth the reward. Aviary is easily the best album of the year that I can hold in my hands right now. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you got something out of it. I wish absolutely everyone the best from the new year, which is about to unfold in front of our very eyes. This has been Ricky live from the Rick the Light channel, and Krayshawn is still the GOAT.